I drove my drunk boss home. What his wife did after changed my life forever. The night I decided to drive my drunk boss home was supposed to be just another forgettable Tuesday. It was raining. The kind of rain that doesn't fall straight down but comes at you sideways, like the weather itself has a personal grudge. I was tired. My shoes were soaked through before I even reached the parking lot. And if I'm being completely honest with you, I almost didn't do it. I almost walked right past him, hunched over the hood of his car in the parking garage, fumbling with his keys like a man trying to solve a puzzle he couldn't quite see anymore. I almost told myself it wasn't my problem, that somebody else would handle it, that I had my own life to get home to. But I didn't walk past him. And that single choice, made in the span of about 3 seconds while standing in a cold, fluorescent-lit parking garage on a Tuesday night, set off a chain of events that would completely and permanently change the direction of my life. My name is Daniel. Daniel Reeves. And this is my story. Let me take you back to the beginning, because if you want to understand why that night meant so much, you need to understand where I was coming from. You need to understand what my life looked like before that Tuesday, before the rain, before everything. I grew up in a small town called Millhaven, the kind of town that appears on maps but rarely appears in conversations. We had one grocery store, one high school, one diner where the coffee was always burned and the pie was always perfect, and a deeply held community belief that the best thing a young person could do was stay exactly where they were born and learn to be content with it. Not everyone in Millhaven was unhappy, plenty of people found genuine joy and purpose there. But I was the kind of kid who lay awake at night staring at the ceiling and feeling like something was pulling at me from the outside, like the world beyond our county lines was calling my name and I just hadn't figured out how to answer yet. My parents were good people. I want to be very clear about that. My mother, Louise, worked 2 jobs for most of my childhood, mornings at the elementary school as a lunch aide and evenings at a laundromat 2 towns over. My father, Gerald, worked construction until his back gave out when I was 14, and after that he worked odd jobs, fixing lawnmowers and appliances out of our garage, making just enough to keep us from falling behind. They were proud people. They never complained in front of us kids, never let us feel like we were poor even when we clearly were. But I saw things. I noticed the way my mother counted change at the grocery store, quietly mouthing numbers with her lips. I noticed the way my father sat at the kitchen table some nights, staring at a pile of bills with an expression I didn't have a word for when I was young but would come to recognize later as quiet desperation. I had a younger sister, Molly, who was everything sunshine is supposed to be. 4 years younger than me, with freckles across her nose and a laugh that could make a funeral feel slightly better. Molly never worried about the things I worried about. She had a gift for living entirely inside the present moment that I envied so deeply I sometimes felt guilty about it. While I was lying awake at night catastrophizing about the future, Molly would be asleep within 30 seconds of her head hitting the pillow, genuinely untroubled by the kind of existential weight I had been carrying since approximately age 9. I worked hard in school. Not because I particularly loved school, but because I understood, in that instinctive way that children of struggling families often understand, that education was the ladder and I needed to climb it. I won a partial scholarship to a state university 3 hours from Millhaven. The night I got the acceptance letter, my mother cried at the kitchen table. My father shook my hand with both of his, which was the closest he ever came to weeping. I took out loans for the rest of the tuition. Loans that I would spend the next decade of my life thinking about, feeling their weight in my chest every single month when the statement arrived. College was both the best and most disorienting experience of my life up to that point. I was suddenly surrounded by people who had grown up with things I'd only seen in movies, family vacations, new cars, laptops that actually worked, the casual assumption that the world was fundamentally going to be okay. I felt like I was learning 2 languages simultaneously, the academic content of my business degree and the unspoken social language of people who had always had enough. I was fluent in neither for a long time. I made friends, slowly. I worked part-time jobs all 4 years. I graduated with a degree in business administration and a deep, specific hunger to prove that where I came from didn't have to define where I was going. And then I moved to the city. And the city, as cities tend to do, humbled me completely. The job market was not waiting for me with open arms. I sent out dozens of applications in my first month after graduation, wearing a suit I'd bought secondhand that was slightly too short in the sleeves, sitting in coffee shops and libraries because my apartment, a studio I shared with a guy named Marcus who worked night shifts and left passive-aggressive notes about dishes, didn't have reliable internet. I got rejections. I got silence. I got one interview for a sales position where the interviewer spent most of our conversation looking at his phone. I took a job at a shipping logistics company called Hartwell & Associates after 3 months of searching. It wasn't glamorous. The office was on the 7th floor of a building that smelled permanently of old coffee and toner cartridges. The work was mostly data entry, spreadsheet management, coordinating delivery schedules, fielding complaints from clients who felt their packages were taking too long to get from one side of the country to the other. But it was a salary. It was health insurance. It was a foothold. My boss was a man named Richard Calloway. Richard was 53 years old and had been at Hartwell & Associates for over 20 years. He was a big man, not fat, exactly, but substantial, the kind of man who took up space in a room both physically and energetically. He had thick gray hair that he combed back, wire-rimmed glasses that he wore on the end of his nose when he was reading, and the permanent expression of a man who was running slightly behind on something. He was sharp. Analytically gifted in a way that I recognized and respected even when I found him difficult. He could look at a logistics problem that had stumped the rest of the team for a week and see the solution in minutes. He had an almost mechanical mind for systems and efficiency. He was also demanding in a way that the rest of the office found suffocating. Richard expected perfection. Not good, perfection. Reports were returned with red pen marks for grammatical errors that had nothing to do with the data they contained. Meetings started at the exact scheduled minute, and if you arrived 30 seconds late, Richard would look at you over his glasses in a way that made you want to apologize to everyone you'd ever met. He didn't yell. He was somehow worse than yelling, he was precise. Cold. Clinical in his disappointment. When something went wrong on the team, he would sit you down and walk you through every step of where the error had occurred, and it was like being a bug under a magnifying glass on a sunny day. Most people at Hartwell found Richard intolerable. There was a group chat among the staff, I found out about it 6 months in, called Calloway's Circus, where people shared their most frustrating Richard stories. I was added to the group and I read the messages, but I never really contributed, because something about it made me uncomfortable. Not that I didn't understand the frustration. I understood it deeply. But something about Richard struck me as more complicated than the version of him that existed in that group chat. I noticed things about Richard that other people didn't seem to notice, or maybe didn't care to notice. I noticed that he was always the first person in the office and the last person to leave. I noticed that he rarely talked about his personal life, and when he did, it was in brief, carefully contained sentences, my wife or my son, as if he was reporting information rather than sharing it. I noticed that on Fridays, especially in the last few months before the night that changed everything, he would sometimes sit in his office with the door almost closed and I would catch a glimpse of him just sitting there, perfectly still, staring at nothing, with an expression on his face that reminded me uncomfortably of my father at the kitchen table with those bills. I noticed that he had started coming back from lunch with a smell about him. Subtle at first. Then less subtle. Nobody on the team talked about it. Not directly, anyway. There were glances exchanged when Richard left for lunch and came back 40 minutes later with his eyes slightly different than they'd been. There were careful conversations conducted just out of earshot. There was a general, unspoken agreement to look in the other direction. I looked in the other direction too. For a while. The company holiday party that year was held at a restaurant downtown, a private room that Hartwell had booked, white tablecloths and an open bar and a DJ who played music that nobody over 40 could identify. I didn't particularly want to go. Holiday parties at workplaces always had a specific kind of social friction I found exhausting, the performance of enjoying yourself in front of people you spent most of the year just trying to work alongside professionally. But attendance was essentially mandatory, the way these things always are when they're framed as optional. I went. I had 2 drinks over the course of 3 hours, ate some food that was better than I expected, made conversation with colleagues I didn't see often because they worked on different floors. The evening was fine. Unremarkable. Richard was there, and for the first hour or two he was fine, or at least, he was the version of himself that existed at company functions, slightly loosened up, making the kind of jokes that were actually funny because he was a smart man, and smart men, when they choose to be funny, can be very funny. He toasted the team. He acknowledged achievements. For a couple of hours, I saw a Richard Calloway that almost nobody in that group chat would have recognized, and I thought, not for the first time, about how many versions of a person exist that we never bother to look for. But the open bar was open for a reason, and Richard made use of it. I watched it happen gradually over the course of the evening, the way his posture changed, the way his eyes lost their precision, the way his voice got louder and then, strangely, quieter. By 9 o'clock he was talking too long to the accounting manager about something that I couldn't quite follow. By 9:30 he was sitting alone at the edge of the room with a drink he wasn't quite finishing. People started leaving. Coats were retrieved, goodbyes were said, Ubers were summoned. I was putting on my coat near the door when Janice from HR appeared at my elbow and said, very quietly, "Someone should probably make sure Richard gets home okay." She said it in that tone people use when they want someone else to volunteer for something without having to make a request themselves. I looked around the room. Most people had already left. The few who remained were saying their goodbyes, pointedly not looking at Richard's corner of the room. "I'll take care of it," I said. And then I wondered why I'd said that, because taking care of Richard Calloway was not something I had planned or wanted to do that evening. I went over to him. He looked up at me, or rather, he looked in my direction, which wasn't quite the same thing. "Reeves," he said. "Good work this quarter." Which was the first genuinely direct compliment he had ever given me and was delivered in a moment when he probably wouldn't remember it. "Thank you," I said. "How are you getting home tonight?" A pause. Something complicated moved across his face. "I'm fine," he said. The automatic answer. The reflexive one. "I don't think you should drive," I said, as carefully as I could. He looked at me for a long moment, and I prepared myself for the cold precision of his disappointment directed at me personally. But it didn't come. Instead, something behind his eyes shifted slightly, like a door opening a crack, and he said, "No. Probably not." And then, very quietly, as if the admission cost him something he'd already been running low on, "I appreciate that, Reeves." I called him a cab that night, his car would stay in the restaurant's parking structure, and I rode with him to make sure he actually got into it and told the driver his address. As he got in, he looked back at me with those slightly unfocused eyes and said something that I almost didn't hear. He said, "It's been a rough year." And then the door closed and the cab pulled away and I stood on the sidewalk in the December cold, thinking about what a strange and quietly heartbreaking sentence that was. That was in December. The following Tuesday, the one with the rain, the one that matters most, came in early February. I had been working late finishing a client report that was due the next morning and had taken me much longer than it should have because the data I needed from another department had come in 3 hours delayed and incomplete. By the time I had something that resembled a finished document, it was 9:15 in the evening. The building was nearly empty. The cleaners had come through and gone. The overhead lights had switched to the motion sensor mode that turned most of the office into a grid of shadows. I was gathering my things when I heard something. A sound from the direction of Richard's office that I almost couldn't categorize, not words, exactly. More like the sound of effort. Like something heavy being moved. I walked toward the sound, not thinking particularly clearly because I was tired and my brain was operating on a minimal budget. Richard's office door was open. He was standing, barely, at his desk, trying to collect papers that had already been collected, moving them from one side of the desk to the other in a way that suggested his hands weren't taking direction well. His jacket was on. His tie was loosened. He looked like a man who had been trying to leave for quite some time and hadn't managed it. On his desk, I noticed, between the papers and the keyboard, a bottle. Bourbon. Not full. Not empty either. He didn't notice me in the doorway at first. He was concentrating very hard on the papers. When he finally looked up and saw me, he straightened instinctively, that automatic professional reflex, and then immediately seemed to realize that straightening wasn't going to help. "Reeves," he said. "Mr. Calloway," I said. We looked at each other. The building hummed its late-night hum. Rain hit the windows. "I was just finishing up," he said. "I can see that," I said, in a tone I hoped was neutral rather than condescending. He nodded, a slow, deliberate nod that was doing a lot of work. "Have a good night," he said. Which was clearly a dismissal, even delivered by a man who was currently not entirely certain which way was up. I should have said good night and left. Every rational calculation pointed toward the door. He was my boss. This was deeply personal territory. He hadn't asked for help. He had, in fact, just told me to leave. And yet. "Do you have your keys?" I asked. A pause. "Why?" "Because I'd like to drive you home," I said. "If that's okay." The silence that followed lasted long enough that I could hear the rain against the glass very clearly. Richard looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read, something between resistance and relief, two emotions that don't usually live together but somehow find room in the same face when a person is exhausted enough. "You don't need to do that," he said. "I know," I said. "I'd like to." Another pause. Then, "My car is in the garage on sea level." "Okay," I said. "Let me get your coat." The drive to Richard's house took about 35 minutes through rain and late-night traffic. Richard sat in the passenger seat of his own car, a dark blue Volvo that smelled like pine air freshener and old coffee, and was quiet for most of the journey. Not in an uncomfortable way, but in the way of someone who is conserving energy. He gave me the address and then watched the city go past the window. "About 15 minutes in," he said. "How long have you been with the company?" "Almost 2 years," I said. He nodded. "You're good at your job," he said. Not in the way he'd said it at the holiday party, this was clearer. More deliberate. Like he'd thought about it. "Better than you probably know." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said thank you. "I haven't been the easiest person to work for," he said. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was something in the neighborhood of one. "You have high standards," I said carefully. A sound came from him that was almost a laugh. "That's one word for it," he said. Then nothing more for a while. We were passing through a quieter part of the city, streets lined with older homes, trees whose bare branches made patterns against the streetlights, when he said, and I could tell from the quality of the pause before it that he hadn't entirely planned on saying it, "My son is sick." He said it the way you say something that you've been carrying for so long that the weight of it has become physical. I didn't respond right away. I kept my eyes on the road and gave the sentence the space it deserved. "He's 17, Richard said. He was diagnosed 8 months ago. Leukemia." The word landed in the car like a stone dropped in still water, sending ripples into all the silence around it. "He's been through 2 rounds of chemotherapy. He lost his hair twice. Missed most of his junior year." He paused. "He keeps telling us he's fine. Keeps telling us not to worry." 17 years old, sitting in a hospital chair with tubes in his arm, telling his parents not to worry about him. I thought about Molly. I thought about what I would do if it were Molly sitting in that chair. I felt something tighten in my chest that I couldn't quite name. "I'm sorry," I said. "I'm really sorry, Mr. Calloway." "Richard," he said quietly. "You drove me home in the rain. Call me Richard." I nodded. We didn't say much more. He directed me the last few turns and then we were pulling into the driveway of a house on a tree-lined street, a warm-looking house, brick-fronted, with a light on in the front window that created a rectangle of gold against the dark and rain. It was the kind of light that looks like someone is home, which is exactly what it was. I put the car in park. "Can you make it in?" I asked. "Yes," he said. And then, reaching for the door handle, he stopped and turned back to me. "You didn't have to do this. I want you to know I understand that." "I know," I said. He got out of the car. I watched him walk carefully up the front path. The front door opened before he reached it. I was about to back out of the driveway when the front door opened again and a woman stepped out onto the porch. She was perhaps 50, with dark hair cut short and kind eyes that I could somehow tell were kind even from the driveway in the rain. She was holding a jacket around her shoulders. A guy